Again, thank you so much for joining us. It's such a pleasure to be in conversation. And I would love if we could start with the broadest strokes. Would you mind introducing yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah. My name is Serena Lukas Bhandar. I am a writer and artist of Punjabi, Sikh, and Welsh and Irish descent. I live and work on the territories of the ʷəŋən and Sandwich peoples. I've been on these territories for about 10 years now, and I grew up nearby on the territories of the Malahat and Quitsim peoples. So I've always lived close to Victoria, and so I've always been really saturated in this kind of very West Coast, but I think we do have like a thriving art scene here, and it's been interesting coming out and exploring it, and meeting Michelle through the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria. I write, but I also do some kinds of intergenre kind of experimental performance art. I'm always looking to branch out and try new things. I also deliver writing workshops. A lot of my practice is really based around collaboration and community, finding opportunities to really connect with people. That's when I feel my most creative and my most, just feels very wholesome. Yeah, and healing, definitely. Lately, a lot of my work has been to do with ancestry and ancestors. As I said, I have some family in the Punjab, and that's where I'm trying to figure out. Obviously, there is a rich tradition of gender nonconformity and transness around the world, and analogs of being transgender that exist outside our Western frameworks of it. And so I'm really excited to be delving into my ancestry and trying to find those examples of people who broke away from gender norms and gender roles in the past, and bring that out in my work. Right now I'm editing an issue of Room magazine, which is a fantastic literary journal published in Vancouver, and the theme of that issue is ancestors. And that'll be coming out in the spring of 2022. Yeah, I've got a lot on the go, and I'm really excited to talk more about it all. Yeah.
Fantastic. I wonder, I am going to delve into a question in a minute about, your interpretation of being invited to participate in the Feminist Art Field School. But as I was going through the readings that you shared with us and thinking about your practice, I really started to think about interdisciplinarity and how when I lived in Toronto, most of the artists that I knew of who worked in an interdisciplinary way did so in a way that was sort of meant to intervene in kind of the mainstream art spaces. And what I was thinking about as I was reading your work was how interdisciplinarity is a kind of political practice for you, and it's not to the end of, sort of presentation in a mainstream place. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about interdisciplinarity and collaboration in your work before we move on to the "what does feminism mean to you" question.
I would love to answer that question. And interdisciplinary is a really good word. And also I just think there's so many different words that line up with that kind of, that ethos and that kind of way I approach my practice, which is, it's very hybridized. It's very, what's the word, intergenre. It's really mixing and matching, the best pieces of what I love about, nonfiction, what I love about poetry, what I love about art, and being able to facilitate stuff. I also have like a strong background in anti-violence work, and I worked for several years at the Anti-Violence Project at UVic, delivering workshops and supporting survivors of sexualized violence. And so much of my work feels like, again, like an intervention into systems of harm and trying to introduce, support and representation, I guess is maybe a easy way of putting it. trying to, you know, tell the stories that I never really heard growing up, and tell them in ways that make sense to me, rather than ways that will be the most marketable or the most digestible, but telling them in the ways that actually challenge, you know, narratives, and challenge people to think about, you know, the ways that they go about in the world. And yeah, I'm trying to think what else sparks that. I actually did some gender studies classes in my undergrad. I was initially thinking about doing a double major, but didn't end up doing that. But I really appreciated just being able to like dip into different schools of thought and different approaches to the work. There's so much variety in the ways people approach, you know, feminism, and the ways people approach art, and it's yeah, my brain doesn't work in a way that like limits myself to, you know, one approach. I just like to transgress all kinds of boundaries, and it's just the way my brain works. Yeah.
And perhaps picking up on that, I would love to hear more about your investment in the local. So when we started our conversation, you had talked about living on the island for your whole life and the potential of leaving. And I think that, you know, in some ways, people have fantasies of the elsewhere as the place where certain things will happen. And I think that there's something really dynamic and rich about thinking critically and creatively and capaciously about the local.
Yeah, I feel very rooted in Victoria on these territories, and I feel like I've done a lot of, you know, great work to support folks on these territories, and I hope that, you know, that, I mean, I know that work will continue whether or not I'm here, but it's great to be able to like see seeds that I've planted, you know, bearing fruit, you know, and just to see how things are progressing. I think I was a very idealistic when I first came to Victoria, and I think I've become more cynical about I don't know, politics and you know, feminism as time has gone by, but I still have a lot of hope, I think, about how things are going, and I see a lot of great developments at the same time in, you know, supporting Indigenous sovereignty and supporting so many different aspects of our communities that, you know, really do need that support. Yeah, and it feels like there's more space for racialized artists, for trans artists, for all kinds of stuff like that. Yeah.
Great. So now that you've been transparent about your cynicism about feminism, let's come back to that question about you know, what you thought when we invited you to be part of the Feminist Art Field School, and what feminism means to you, what feminist art means to you, what are its potentials and limitations?
It's a big question. When I was first invited by you guys, I was thinking about, gosh, I was thinking a lot about the different types of feminism that I was learning about when I was in gender studies classes in my undergrad, and the feminist kind of thinking that I did learn from, you know, great professors like Satara and Thea Caccioni. You know, I think some of the language has progressed since then, but the underlying themes of, you know, empowerment and of equity, certainly, they still ring true. And I think feminism in general, just it's hard to sum it up in, you know, one sentence, because there is so much diversity in feminist communities, in, you know, feminist areas of thought. You know, there are some folks who would say that, you know, trans exclusionary and sex work exclusionary ways of thinking are part of feminism, and I don't necessarily subscribe to that, but at the same time, I recognize that there is a huge diversity in feminism, and we know that feminism hasn't always, you know, you know, there are some shitty sides to feminism. Like there is white feminism, which can really, you know, take away power from racialized communities. There is, you know, again, yeah, trans exclusionary and sex work exclusionary brands of feminism. And so it's tricky. And I would say I definitely am a feminist, but I can imagine that means a very different thing to me than it does to some other folks. And lately I've been feeling like I don't think I am very political so much as I live politically. My act of being myself, being a proud trans woman of color is, you know, flies in the face of some folks who would say that's not a valid identity. That's not a valid part of feminism. And it's, you know, it's frustrating that that's, you know, a debate that still happens, but yeah, I think I do draw some satisfaction from the sense that things are changing, things are always going to change. Feminism is always going to change over time. And yeah, again, it's just such a wide topic. It's really hard to break it down into just one simple, you know, sentence of what it means to me, but it means a lot of different things to me. And I would say I am cynical about it at times, especially when I think we get caught up in, you know, the specificity of language. And I think there is some importance there around, you know, respecting the way people, you know, define themselves. And at the same time, I think there's a lot of, you know, person-to-person connection that gets lost when we break ourselves up into these different camps. And yeah, it's an interesting place to, you know, explore, an interesting movement to be a part of, and it's not always good, but it's yeah. I'm hopeful things are, you know, getting better, and that you know, yeah, I'm sure you can both speak to that as well. You know, yeah, it's yeah.
Yeah, you know, I think when we were imagining this incubator and this opportunity to join in conversation with so many incredible artists, we already knew that our terms of engagement were troubled. We already could recognize from the beginning that the very proposal of a feminist art field school, we couldn't even move from there. And so we thought, well, why don't we cluster those words and then critically interrogate them from a variety of different sides? And I think, you know, your response has animated much of what we think as well, which is how can we borrow and choose from? How can we be feral in our affinities? And, you know, one of the things that is a through line in the collection of the field school and its many interlocutors is a deep investment and an engagement with artistic practice as one of the ways in which politics takes place, and one of the ways in which lives and narratives are made and unmade. And so perhaps this is another equally giant question, but I think it's a useful one on the tails of a question about feminism, which is, why is art, broadly conceived, one of the modes through which you choose to communicate?
Yeah, it's funny, like I just said that, you know, like I don't feel like I live politically. I don't feel like I am political, but that my life is political in some ways. But I also feel like my life is art, you know. It's I mean, politics can be art in its own way, I suppose. But I've been creating art, I've been writing as long as I can remember, and it's just been the way that I've always expressed myself. I am one of those people where I have a really vast and internal world that I don't always communicate to people, but when I do communicate it, it's you know, through my writing or through just chatting with people about what I'm thinking. I really feel seen, and I think it really creates a lot of validity to different experiences that a lot of people share, but I don't think we always talk about. There was a really beautiful poem I wrote on Facebook earlier, which was something about if you have a wound or if if your reader has a wound, maybe your words can be the words that fit that wound. If you're worried that your words won't quite match up with what people are looking for, actually there might be somebody who has a wound that your words exactly fit to. And I think, yeah, even if there's so much divisiveness and you know, so much separation between different, you know, schools of thought and different communities, a lot of us have the same struggles across the board. And thinking historically, our ancestors had the same struggles as us in many different ways. They might not have looked the same, but knowing that our ancestors were just like us in many ways, and you know, we're queer and we're trans in their own ways, is so beautiful. And it's so important for me to be able to express that through art and to express that commonality of experience that highlights our unique, you know, experiences, but also recognizes that we can all connect on a very basic level to each other, which I think is really beautiful. Yeah.
Something that you just said makes me think of the link that you gave us to the co-authored, multi-authored article, What Else Might Be Possible Towards a Decolonial Criticism. And you talk about the kind of lacks of mainstream or typical art criticism, and talk about replacing it with a kind of art criticism that is based in storytelling, which is such a beautiful idea. And thinking about what you were just talking about, the writing filling the wound, it makes me think about you know, how art criticism can so often like narrow the audience that understands the work even more. And that if you were to replace art criticism with storytelling, then it would offer so many more points of entry for different people, different audiences, a more various audience to understand artwork, which can be difficult to understand. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about your thinking around that. You know, the article had so many authors that we just sort of got a hint of your thinking around this idea, and I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, I love writing that article and also contributing to the facilitated conversation that sparked that article, which was called Feedback, Feed Forward, and was run by Integrate Arts Society here in Victoria. There's so many threads of that I want to follow up on. I'm thinking about how, even though I did an undergrad in creative writing at UVic and also worked at UVic for several years, I still feel very much like an outsider in many ways to Canadian literature, to Canadian art, to academic spaces. And I own that outsider experience because I feel like it can, you know, bring some new ways of thinking, or perhaps old ways of thinking that need to be brought back again to art. You know, I'm not really the kind of person who's always following the rules. You know, I'll listen to you when you explain the rules, but I always have my own way of thinking about things, and I like to try to bring that up as much as I can. And storytelling may not seem as the most intuitive way of reimagining criticism, but all of the best writing that I've read about art and about, you know, writing about writing and stuff like that has always been stuff that feels like it has a very strong heart to it, even if it's critical or, you know, trying to hold some pieces of an art to account. It's still connecting in a very communal and relational way. I'm trying to think of some examples, but I mean, that article is just a really good example of, you know, different people engaging and suggesting different models of criticism. And so our models of criticism, you know, vary and differ, but we're all hitting at this central theme, which is that our art needs to be, our ways of thinking about art need to be more relational and grounded in who is creating them and who is not being afforded platforms to create and share their work. Yeah, trying to think of the other threads that were from that question. Can you read the question? I think, or yeah.
I think I was just asking about what you think about storytelling as criticism as a way to expand who has access to contemporary art.
Yeah, I mean, stories are also a very fundamental way of communication between people. I think of how much I enjoy just hearing stories from my friends and from my family, and how much I learn from those stories. All of the best, I think, in my mind, media that I experience fits into a narrative. It might not be like a traditional narrative. It might not, you know, have a beginning, middle, and end, but it does, you know, I guess that's the way that I think, you know, as a writer, I think in stories. And so that's the way I express myself. And that's the way how I organize my thoughts. And so that's what makes sense to me. I think criticism as a whole, I think could just benefit from reconsidering how is it expressed and how is it accessible to different folks. That article that we wrote also talks about legibility and, you know, the idea of maybe we don't always have to translate every, you know, culturally specific concept into the mainstream or into, you know, dominant ways of thought. And I don't think those two different thoughts are opposed. I think there needs to be more accessibility of in media and in, you know, spaces where you create media, publishing and all of that stuff, to, you know, ideas that challenge dominant ways of thinking, and to, you know, media that and writing that challenges that, and art that challenges that. But yeah, I think there's ways to do that without, you know, having it dissolve into just the, you know, the melting pot of the mainstream and lose, you know, the very culturally specific and different concepts that belong in those cultures, and that you know, people, I think about, you know, how much joy I have like researching different stuff on, even on Wikipedia, and just delving into different there's so much depth to our world, and if we expect that everything's going to be translated into our worldview, we lose a lot of the nuance. We lose out on an opportunity to challenge ourselves and to explore something we didn't know existed before.
I think issues of translation are so fascinating, in part too, because I know as a teacher, many times students will approach creative projects and already feel blocked or intimidated by the translation of an idea into a kind of public, be it a kind of writer's block or be it a fear of reception. And I know that you've already articulated yourself as a maker and a teacher and someone who works closely in collaboration with community. And I would be curious if you had any advice or tips to those in our field school who might be thinking about creative projects or thinking about translation, broadly defined, that might unlock some doors for creative opportunity or writing.
Totally. That's a piece I'd love to speak to. That makes me think of all of the writing that I do that I don't share with other people. It makes me think of all of the notes that I take on my phone of just stray observations that I have, you know, pages and pages of notes on my phone that I don't share with anyone. And if I looked at them and wanted to explain them to somebody else, I could probably do it, but some stuff I'm happy just keeping to myself. And if I'm starting on a new creative project, it is very limiting to me if I am always thinking about how it's going to be received, how it's going to be, appreciated. And university was a really hard time in some ways, doing an undergrad in creative writing and having grades attached to my writing was, it seemed very counterintuitive in some ways. Like you don't really get that in the real world. And so what was important for me was to really hone in on my craft and to just, I hate to say it, but just forget that there's a grade and that's going to be attached to anything and start there. Start with just creating something. Yeah, it's a hard space to get into, but I find, mindfulness practices, I find talking with people about your ideas, even if you're not sure it's going to go anywhere, really sparks stuff. For me anyways. And then, once you've got something together that you really like, then maybe you can think about the expectations of the class. And if it doesn't feel like it quite matches up with that, you could make a copy of it and change it to something that matches up with the class, and you could keep the original idea that maybe is something else, for yourself. I'm really into the idea of, recycling and repurposing ideas. Like if we believe that, no idea is new, then, and I don't actually believe that. I think there's plenty of new ideas that are created every day that are, reimaginings at least of other ideas and concepts. And I think there's just so much potential in being able to, do the work and get the grade, but then also focus on, what the parts that really bring you joy. And often those line up, and this sounds like a great class. Like I loved being able to do creative projects in my undergrad, and usually the ideas that I had usually pretty lined up with what was being expected. And even if it wasn't quite what was expected in the class, I usually found some other ways to repurpose the stuff that didn't quite fit into my own work. I really, creative projects are they can be so fun, and it's really important to lean into that fun part and to, appreciate it while you got it.
Since you're talking about your creative writing classes at UVic, I'm going to move us into talking about your piece called Otherhood. But I wondered, given how long I've been involved in the art world and that I've always sort of had connections to art schools and art students in whatever vicinity that I've been working, there's sort of long been a kind of concern amongst students who want to speak about issues of identity that there's not being space for that in academia, and or some students complain that if you're Black art student, you're expected to make Black art, and other students have had the experience of professors trying to just sort of like force any reference to identity out of the work that they're making. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Otherhood. This is many questions in one. I'm interested in the format or the form that you've used for that piece. Of course, I'm interested in its content, but I'm also interested to know whether you started to write pieces that sort of address, the realities of your life as a trans woman when you were a student. Were you able to do that?
Yeah, I was very deeply in the closet, even to myself, when I was in my undergrad, for most of it anyways. And so it wasn't really until my final year that I was really able to embrace that and to explore what else might be possible. I feel like that's the title of that collaborative essay we wrote. Yeah, I really loved my time in the creative writing program, and at the same time, and I think this has changed since then, I think a lot of what we were taught was, to write according to the conventions of, Canadian literature and the conventions of, what is a short story, what is a essay, what is a poem, and there wasn't a lot of room for mixing those genres. And since I've graduated and, over time, I've really come to embrace that I love writing about real life experiences. I love writing that nonfiction element, but I love doing it in a way that embraces narrative and also embraces a poetic kind of sensibility. I think that comes across quite well in Otherhood. It feels like a prose poem in some ways, and it's also an essay. And there's so many different things in poetry that you can really pull from to emphasize stuff in writing. There's tools of imagery and of metaphor and the musicality of words that I feel like sometimes get lost in standard prose. And I just love reading books that really, where the writers have really, read their work aloud and thought about how it feels to read that work aloud and to share that work. All of the great writers that I can think of right now are just other trans women who I also love, like Kai-Cheng Thom, Vivek Shraya. Yeah, there's so many great writers who really embrace the ways you can writing so beautiful and so musical and still really tell a great story and expose parts of yourself that you don't often get a chance to talk about. Otherhood is a very vulnerable essay, I will say, and I'm happy that I'm able to share it in both the book that it's going to be published in and with this class, because I see my vulnerability as a shield made out of love for myself. It's something that I own who I am, and I own, all the parts of myself. Otherhood talks, quite intimately about my body and about my experiences with transition. And I feel like that's something that has not really had a space to be talked about on the terms of trans people. I think a lot about all the interviews that were happening around the time that Laverne Cox was on the cover of Time magazine, and it was always, very interviewers kind of coming across as, very, well, just inappropriate in the ways they were asking people about their bodies, asking trans people about invasively about their bodies. And I think it's important to respect the boundaries of trans people and to not, necessarily just invade their worlds in that kind of way. But at the same time, there needs to be space for us to talk about our bodies on our own terms. And I'm really grateful that this upcoming book can be a space for that. And that my writing is, in general, is a space where I can just express myself and have that be validated as, an important part of literature, I guess. Yeah.
I love your invocation of Kai-Cheng Thom and Vivek Shraya in the conversation, in part because, as a trans person who makes work in public as well, I pay a lot of attention to when people become isolated as singular or exceptional cases, or the one piece of trans content in an otherwise entirely straight cis show, or the one feminist text, as Michelle and I like to talk about, on a syllabus that otherwise ignores the existence of women in feminist theory, right? And so I think multiplicity is such a key strategy. And your suggestion also has me thinking about the ways in which we assign work in the field school. And I think it would be really exciting to point to and to perhaps even co-program alongside your unit some of Vivek's work as another form of engagement. And I think that one of the things you said too that has me thinking is, of course, transness as method. And so what happens when we write something on a page and read it aloud, and it has a kind of genre hybridity that unsettles the terms of the engagement. So what does something become when it is no longer on the page? And I think that those are really exciting and challenging provocations. And I think perhaps the opportunity to read your work alongside the work of others would also offer up some exciting new pathways for our field school participants.
Totally. They both have so many incredible essays and articles online that I'm sure you could share with class. And there's so much great writing that I read online these days that I just would love to hold up and share with everyone. And yeah.
And so one of the things that you keep saying, which I love, is, I went on Wikipedia and I found, or I went online and I found. And so the internet seems to hold a place. And, I think a lot in the context of our work here about the structure of institutions like galleries and museums and schools. But of course, the internet is its own institutional force. And it's also an incredible opening for world making for many trans and non-binary and gender nonconforming people. And I'm curious, what role does the internet play? Do you consider the internet an institution? So definitely don't need to agree with me.
That's
but what role does the internet play in your practice?
I don't think I don't think the internet can be an institution, because it's like anybody can really host their own website, and so it's so fragmented. There are certainly websites that are institutions, like Wikipedia definitely is an institution. Even if it's, kind of crowdsourced and pulled together from, thousands of people pulling it together. Yeah, that's a really good thought though. The internet is kind of where I came of age, and, a lot of folks of our generation really came of age on the internet and discovered who they were on the internet. And so it's become, a space where I create a lot, and where I, see other people creating. And again, I think I come back to, the idea of like feeling like an outsider in, traditional art spaces and physical kind of spaces. And the internet has always felt like a space where you aren't, you can construct whatever identity makes sense for you, and you can try on different identities. And that's really important, to be able to not just explore, different areas of the world, but also explore different parts of yourself and see that reflected. Often only online is it's really huge, and it can be really helpful for folks who are feeling isolated. I mean, it's been so helpful. And I mean, at the same time, social media can also be so overwhelming, and it's, there's so many different ways that you can connect online, that it's important to, have some boundaries around it. But I've learned so much, through online spaces. And at the same time, I think it comes back to that person-to-person connection. Like, the things that are on the internet aren't static, and they're always, they are all created by somebody. And so I have the best experiences online when I'm connecting with someone's words on what feels like a one-to-one relationship. And we could talk for hours, I'm sure, about parasocial relationships and all the, the different ways that those have, blossomed, especially with the internet. But yeah, I feel like I've connected with so many great communities through the internet. And yeah, it's that fundamental sense of connection that really is what brings it back to me, is just where can I find people who, share interests, or that whose interests, broaden my worldview, and allow me to explore parts of myself that I never really knew existed. Yeah.
Well, this is the point in the narrative arc where we usually come to a question about what role do institutions play in creating more just futures. And you've started to hint at, how the internet can play a role in creating community and allowing connection. And I think those are things that are at the basis of a more just future. I think when we coined the question, given our day jobs, we were thinking about academia and museums. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on how those spaces measure up in their capacity for allowing people to create connections and come together and develop relationships and create a more just future.
Yeah. I do love the connections I've made in my time at UVic, and I did have a really great time in my undergrad. But I was thinking about this question. I was thinking about, if I could reimagine, an institution like the University of Victoria, or just, universities in general, in a way that's more equitable. I think obviously academic institutions have a role to play in creating more just futures. I think access to education is so important, and it really can improve your life in so many different ways. But if we come back down to it, I feel like really it's money that really defines how our interactions are with institutions, whether it's a university or it's the government, or different public institutions. I think really it really comes down to money, and it really comes down to those different kinds of barriers that people experience in trying to learn and to explore outside of their worldview, or their experience. And I mean, it's not a new thing to propose that education should be free, but I think it's something that needs to continue to be championed. And the role that I think institutions can play in more just futures is continuing to be a space of learning. But I feel like I'm rambling at this point, but it's important to just think about who has access to education and how is that access provided. I had a great time in gender studies classes in my undergrad, and at the same time, I feel like there's so much room to explore new opportunities and territory when you aren't worried about grades, when you aren't worried about how much a course is costing you. I don't know if there's a solution in there that I can really propose yet beyond just making education free for everyone, which is a big ask. But I think about all the great experiences I had, connecting with other students, connecting with professors, the whole community the communities that I got to engage with on campus. That was a really important thing for me. And I don't know. I'm trying to think about stuff for museums as well. There's some really great discussions about the Royal BC Museum, especially, and the different Indigenous collections that they have, and conversations around repatriation, or just turning over the tools of archiving and preserving work over to the people who that art belongs to, I think, and that hurts that those materials, those ancestral materials, being able to, if someone wants to, if an Indigenous nation wants to preserve and share their what their nation has created, I think that's a really beautiful step forward. It's that kind of autonomy piece, and I think that again that comes back in with universities, like being able to engage with universities on your own terms without the expectations of trying to get the best degree that you can to get a job. I feel like I'm getting a little gradually out of my depth, but at the same time I hope this is landing well. I do appreciate this question. It's a big question, and it's one we're going to be talking about for a very long time, definitely.
Absolutely, you know, and it reminds me of where we started in our conversation, which is to say what else might be possible. And I think that these questions by no means have ends and have many pathways and many answers. And it's an exciting opportunity to think. I love when you said, well, if education is free, then maybe we can think about a few other questions, right? These foundational building blocks of access that need our attention. And I would be curious to know where you are going next. What work is most exciting to you?
Yeah, so I have this Ancestors issue of Room magazine coming out in the spring of next year. I'm also working on my first book, which I'm so excited about. It's called The Tale of the Snake Woman. I talk a little about it a little bit in the What Else Might Be Possible essay. I got a Canada Council grant this year to finish it, which is super exciting. I'm feeling more and more less like an outsider in literature and more like someone who is using, you know, the tools of institutions in order to further my own ends and to, you know, connect with community. And I'm really excited to finish that book and get it out into the world. I'm excited to move to Montreal and connect with more people there and continue to connect people online. Yeah, I really am excited to be able to share all of this with your class, and really excited about what might come next from that as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been such a wonderful chat.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So great to see you again, Serena. Thank you.